Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Dan Gardner, is the New York Times best-selling author of Superforecasting, How Big Things Get Done, Risk, and Future Babble. His books have been published in 26 countries and 20 languages. Before becoming an author, Dan was an investigative journalist, recognised with every major award in Canadian journalism. He is an honorary fellow with the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public Policy and International Affairs. This is the second part of my conversation with Dan, where he discusses how boards get big things done on time and within budget, the key biases board members need to watch out for when making decisions, and the relationship between brain and gut in good judgment. We pick the conversation up in our discussion about the role of master builders in project management. Now, I think I'm going to get this stat wrong, but I think it was something like 99.5% of projects are not on time, on budget, and on spec. But there is that 0.5% that are, and within that there are some who are consistently getting it right. I think was it Geary, the architect, is one of those who consistently delivered projects on time, on budget, and on spec. You in the coder included 11 heuristics for better project leadership, which again I love because they resonated so much with my experience as a board member. So one of them was hire a master builder, which maps one-to-one for, make sure you got the right chair in place, make sure you got the right CEO in place, because if you haven't got that, everything else falls apart. But I'm curious to hear from you, which of those heuristics do you think have the most value for those at the board level, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
I would give you my first answer would be the annoying one, which is it depends upon the particular circumstances which you face as to which is most important. So let's just set that aside. I actually think that you've identified the best of the lot. If it's relevant to you, it's the one you should go with, which is hire a master builder. Let me illustrate with one of my favorite stories, which is Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam, I think most people know, is one of the great hydroelectric dams in the world, and it was one of the world's most successful giant projects. It was under budget and ahead of schedule. Pretty amazing stuff. So how did it happen? The answer is one man. I'm being reductionist. I shouldn't say that. One man was incredibly important to that happy outcome. Frank Crowe, an engineer named Frank Crowe, because Frank Crowe was involved in that project from everything from the winning consortium's bid. Frank Crowe put the bid together, and then he oversaw the construction. And he did everything. Who was Frank Crowe? Frank Crowe. Oh, and by the way, I should also mention hydroelectric dams is a terrible category, right? They have horrible results. So hydroelectric dams, hard project category. Frank Crowe is a man who spent his entire life building hydroelectric dams. He loved dams. And he went from site to site to site all over the American West building these hydroelectric dams. And because he was so experienced and he was so good, he started to collect people around him. And so all sorts of different people that would be involved in that sort of project just sort of followed him from one project to the other. So that was, when I say Frank Crowe, I mean Frank Crowe and his team. And so, and the other important aspect of the Hoover Dam is Frank Crowe had always basically dreamed of building a dam at that site. So he'd been thinking about it a very long time. And so what happened? You hired a master builder. The master builder brought the master team, and they delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. If there is a master builder in your project category, and that master builder has a team with amazing proven track record of results, they will charge an arm and a leg. Pay it because they're worth it.
I love that. One of the other heuristics you had in there was this build with Lego, which I think touches on what you were talking about earlier with Fermi and modular thinking. Can you give me an example of where a board might not understand how to turn a problem into modular thinking? I think you gave some examples of things that people just saw as one big blob that they couldn't break down, but actually you demonstrated very effectively how most things can be broken down.
Right. So, yeah, build with Lego simply means if you imagine how Lego works, it's building blocks, click, 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 and they're all interchangeable, and that's what modularity is. And the perfect way to illustrate modularity is the project category with the best results of all the project categories, which is solar power. If you think about what a giant solar farm is, it's the ultimate of modularity. It's just one solar panel, two solar panels, three solar panels. And what happens when you do one thing, then you do that same thing again, then you do that same thing again? You get really good at doing that one thing, right? You get more and more efficient. You're going up the learning curve. You get spectacular results that way. Now, modularity, you could complicate that and say, well, it depends on the project category, modularity, whether you can do it or not. Obviously, solar power, that's modularity. It's inherently modular. It's not complicated. What really is the essence of modularity is repetition. Are you doing something repeatedly? If you're doing it repeatedly, you'll probably get good at it. So, are there at least components of your big project that you can turn into repetition? And here's an example. In Madrid had this gigantic expansion of its subway system. Again, a project category with bad results. And you would say to yourself, well, how do you make that modular, right? So tunnels are subways. That's just what they are. You can't do anything with that. Well, this project was so big that they had to build more than 70 subway stations. So you could, using traditional methods, design and build 70 plus subway stations. That's not what Madrid did. Madrid designed one subway station and they built it 70 plus times. Those two sentences sound almost identical. They're completely different in terms of results. So the question is, if you're thinking about a big project, can you, again, break it down, Fermi style, break it down into its component parts? And are there components, at least components, that you can turn into repetition so that you get very good and you drive costs down and you drive efficiency up?
Interesting. That actually resonates. I was playing tennis earlier, and it's exactly the same. You try and replicate the same shot, and you just adjust yourself to wherever you're standing. Nice parallel there. The final heuristic that you had in your list was build climate mitigation into your project, and that really struck me because we host these masterminds where board members can share challenges they're wrestling with. And we had one recently where someone had been struggling to impose the importance of taking climate risk seriously for their board, and they were being dismissed. And you talk about this in the book, about how climate risk is so abstract that it's not being addressed. And I sense that this is something you feel very frustrated about from the book, if I read that properly. Curious to hear, what can board members listening to this now who perhaps haven't got climate risk top of their agenda, what would you say to them?
Oh, this is a tough one. Climate change in general, if you look at human psychology and you ask yourself, what are the sorts of problems that human beings are going to be naturally good at grappling with? And what are the sorts of problems that human beings will naturally be bad at grappling with? Climate change is like the perfect example of the latter. It's so difficult for us to wrap our heads around it. And as a result, our psychology just doesn't do it. Even if you understand it at a high abstract level, it's also difficult to grasp that all the foundational elements that you're working with in delivering a project could change. So, for example, let me give you an example. I'm sitting here in Ottawa. Here in Canada, we have the Great Lakes. On the Great Lakes, water levels fluctuate. If you're doing any sort of big project on or near the Great Lakes, water level fluctuation will be top of mind. How do you deal with that? Simple. You go and get historical data, and it will show you the range of water level fluctuations. Well, guess what? Climate change may change that in ways that we can't anticipate. In other words, there's this really foundational thing. You think it's solid as bedrock, but that bedrock is turning into ooze. And there are just countless numbers of examples like that where things that we take for granted as givens are no longer givens because the distribution is changing, because climate touches almost everything. And that's why you have to be extremely open-minded and imaginative and thinking in those terms. Because, right, how human would it be if you're dealing with a project on the Great Lakes to not even think of the words climate change? How human is it to simply go with, well, it's always been this way, so it will always be this way. Let us proceed. It's incredibly difficult, and we need to think about it because, as I say, the number of project categories that are influenced by this, potentially impacted by climate change, is just it's limitless. It's spectacular. So it's not a question of politics. It's not. I'm not being a tree hugger here. It's just a question of good project management. We have to get much more serious about climate change.
Well, let's move on to talk about risk. And I'm curious to hear how you would explain to a board member listening to this what they need to understand about how their emotional responses influence their perception of risk.
Yeah. So one of the critical things I think people need to grapple with is everybody knows Daniel Kahneman's System 1, System 2. Well, actually, System 1 and System 2 isn't his own terminology, but he popularized it in Thinking Fast and Slow. Everyone knows that System 1 is intuitive, System 2 is analytical. Everyone knows that System 1 is subject to psychological biases. Sometimes works, often works, but can also lead you astray. And when we talk about these things, people often don't use the language that I just used. They use the language you just used. Emotions. But here's the thing. System 1, intuitive, is almost by definition like it's outside consciousness. You're not aware of it. System 2, analytical, is conscious. Emotions? Are you aware of emotions? When you're angry, are you aware that you're angry? When you're in love, are you aware that you're in love, etc.? And the answer is yes. I actually avoid using the word emotion precisely because people think an emotion, well, that's that big, anger. I get it. Anger can skew my judgment. I've got to be careful of that. No, that's not the danger. The psychological biases we're talking about and these intuitive judgments, they don't feel like emotions. They just feel right. It's just, I know what the answer is. The answer is 42, right? Where'd that come from? That's my intuition told me that. But it doesn't come labeled as intuition. And that's what makes them so dangerous. They simply feel true. And so what you need to recognize is, number one, that's the trap. It's not emotions. And number two, as I said earlier, you need to recognize that there is no vaccine, right? Learning about psychological biases and how they can trip you up does not reduce your odds of being tripped up by psychological biases. It simply doesn't. What does reduce your odds of being tripped up by them is understanding and accepting the fact that you can be tripped up by them. And Danny Kahneman was explicit on this point, and he used to use this himself as an illustration. Accepting that, and therefore becoming hyper self-critical and saying, okay, here's my decision. It feels right. Now I'm going to examine it because it may be wrong. And if you look at really exceptional decision makers, they do this relentlessly, and that's what makes them exceptional thinkers. They're hyper self-critical. So that's point number one. Point number two, and this is very important too. I tend to be one of those people. People tend to line up behind System 1 or System 2. There are people who go with your gut, or no, you have to be analytical. The gut is stupid, right? That's a mistake. Both systems, both ways of making judgments have value. And it's very, very important that we be clear about this. And for a board member, you have to know this. You can, in fact, personify. You can personify this way. Danny Kahneman is the psychologist who was sort of the apostle of, your intuition can trip you up. You have to be more analytical. Okay? But the psychologist Gary Klein is sort of the apostle of, actually, intuition can deliver amazing results. And they both spent their long careers pursuing their lines of research and making these arguments. And these two results sound like, well, that's completely contradictory. They can't both be right? So Klein and Kahneman did something absolutely wonderful. They called it an adversarial collaboration. They actually both sat down and worked together and said, you think one thing, I think seemingly the opposite. How is it possible that we're this far apart? And when they had a good long discussion, they concluded, actually, they called it a failure to disagree. In fact, the two conclusions of these two eminent psychologists were perfectly congruent. They fit together beautifully. What Gary Klein showed in his work was that in certain environments, intuition works wonderfully. And when you have an intuition, an intuitive judgment in the appropriate environment, you should absolutely respect it. Go with your gut. But if you're not in one of those environments, then that's a serious mistake, and that can actually get you killed. To illustrate the difference, Klein used a wonderful story, this is a true story, of a fire captain, a man who's in charge of a bunch of firefighters. And the fire captain is an experienced person. They go into a building, and there's a fire. They're told there's a fire in the kitchen. They go into the kitchen, and the fire captain suddenly feels like something's wrong. He doesn't know what's wrong. He just knows something's wrong. He just knows it in his bones. And he orders everybody out of the building immediately. And they all rush out of the building. And as soon as they get out of the building, the floor collapses. They probably would have died. What happened? The answer is, remember I said it was an experienced fire captain. That fire captain has been in many other kitchen fires. And he knows that in that environment, the sound that you hear, the heat that you feel, all these sensory signals, they're a certain way. There's a certain pattern to them. And when he was in that kitchen, the pattern was wrong. It didn't fit. He knew something was wrong. He felt it. And so he followed his gut. And he was right to follow his gut because, and this is the critical point, he had been repeatedly exposed to that same environment over and over and over again, and the environment is regular, right? The sound of a kitchen fire, one kitchen fire or another kitchen fire, is basically the same. The amount of heat is basically the same, right? There are regular patterns in that environment, and he had been exposed to them many times, and he had gotten good feedback from those environments. So he had learned and trained his intuition. You take that same person and you say, okay, put some money on the stock market. Should you trust your gut? No. His gut has not been trained. Number one, he doesn't have the experience. He hasn't been repeatedly exposed. He hasn't gotten good feedback in that environment. And number two, and more importantly, he's not in a regular environment. It's a very irregular environment. And so there aren't steady patterns from which you can learn. So learning to distinguish between those situations in which it is right and proper and sensible to trust your gut and those situations in which you absolutely should not do that is, I think, an absolutely fundamental skill for any major decision maker.
So I'm interested to think about how that applies to the boardroom, because I guess there's sort of a couple of questions that spring to mind. One is, are there any regular patterns that you face as a board member that would allow you to have that feeling in your bones as a board member who's seen it before? And two, I guess it's also presumably a function of time. Like that fire chief had time pressure, therefore the option of going to the analytical approach was not available to him, or if he'd done it, it would have burnt. Whereas in a boardroom, it's quite rare that you don't have time, though there are occasions. So curious to hear how you think about how that applies in a boardroom.
Yeah, you've summarized it beautifully. That's exactly it. I've worked with the military, for example. The military is an environment in which there is a much wider spectrum of decision making. There are environments in the military. You'll be in situations where you have 3 seconds to make a decision. If you only have 3 seconds, you take the 3 seconds and no more. You do not take 4. You may have 3 minutes. If you have 3 minutes, you take the 3 minutes. If you have 30 minutes, if you have 30 days, etc. Right? You can adjust accordingly, but it's entirely determinant based on the environment in which you find yourself and the particular decision that you are having to make. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to board members, most of the decisions they make, the more important decisions, put it this way, ordering a sandwich for lunch, that's fine. But when it comes to the more important decisions that a board member is going to be making, the overwhelming majority of those decisions are going to be in Danny Kahneman territory, right? They're not going to be decisions where you should be trusting your gut. And that's why, but it's important to make the distinction, even if you are the sort of person who's working in an environment where 98% of your decisions are in Danny Kahneman territory. You should be analyzing them. You should not be trusting your gut. It's important to make that distinction because there are nonetheless people who insist, go with your gut because it sounds admirable, right? It's courageous. It's intuitive. There's a certain magnetic quality to it. And there are people who urge that upon others without making the critical distinction, right? So when people say, gut or analysis, which do you go with? The correct answer is, it depends.
You highlighted in the book the role gender plays in risk perception, but also highlighted that if you strip out educated white men, there is actually no gender difference. I'm interested to hear what you think the implications from that for boards.
Oh, for risk-taking, yeah, it's interesting. So as a species, human beings are overconfident. There's overwhelming evidence to that effect. We all do this. Unless we're suffering from clinical depression, interestingly enough, we tend to be overconfident. However, there is one fundamental distinction, and that is a gender divide. One of the genders is more overconfident than the other, and I will not give you a cookie if you guess which one, because we all know the answer. And then to expand upon that, when it comes to risk perception, it turns out that educated white men in Western societies tend to be a lot more bold, tend to be a lot more aggressive, which is to say that they tend to downplay risk to an extent that other groups do not. The implications for board members are clear, and not only from that conclusion, but also from a heap of other research. Diversity is good. I always find myself sort of cringing when I say this because diversity has become such a buzz phrase, right? It's sort of the thing that, nice liberal people say, diversity is good and so on. Diversity is our strength, etc. And because, of course, there's two issues going on. There's diversity as a contributor to good judgment, and then there's diversity as a matter of justice. I'm here to speak about diversity as contributing to good judgment. On the matter of justice, that's another debate. Doesn't have anything to do with me. But I am absolutely adamant that people understand that diversity, fully understood, and that does not mean merely, half a dozen set of demographic boxes. Diversity, more broadly than that, diversity contributes to collective judgment for a very simple reason. You remember way back at the start, I talked about superforecasters being the sorts of people who are actively open-minded. They're constantly going and seeking out other perspectives, contrary perspectives, and they're trying to learn from those other perspectives, and they're synthesizing that information into their own thinking. And that demonstrably improves their own judgment. Well, what's diversity? It's effectively the same thing. You go and get a diverse board, a board from many different backgrounds, many different perspectives. You have them sit down and have a good discussion, and that's a really critical point. What are you doing? You're synthesizing multiple perspectives. And when you synthesize multiple perspectives, you end up with better judgments. It's that simple. And you can scale that up to markets themselves, right? What is a stock market? It's taking all the judgments of millions and millions of people and synthesizing all that information into a final price. So there's a lot of information in that. That is a good signal. It's a very basic principle, and it's true of any form of collective decision making. You do not want people who all think alike making a decision. It's just that simple. And now here's where I'm going to go and be explicit about this. Do race and gender and the other categories which tend to be top of the list when we talk about diversity, do they matter? Certainly they do. Because you know what? I'm a white middle-aged Canadian. If you were speaking to a black middle-aged Canadian, chances are that person would have a considerably different set of life experiences than mine. And that would make that person's perspective different than mine. So if you brought that person into the conversation, would it enrich the conversation? Absolutely would. But it's absolutely so essential to understand that race and gender and so on, that's only the beginning of human diversity. right? I grew up, for example, in rural Canada. Rural Canada, there's very few people there. Most Canadians grow up in cities. My perspective, because of where I grew up, is different than is the perspective of somebody in urban Canada, and so on. Diversity should be understood as this nearly infinitely rich resource that we can mine.
In risk, you highlighted the availability heuristic, what you call the example rule, as by far the most important of the three heuristics identified by Kahneman and Tversky, the other two being anchoring and the representative heuristic, in shaping our perceptions and reactions to risk. Can you expand on that?
Yep, it's the most basic way in which we judge anything. I could mention any potential threat. I could mention the prevalence of a particular bird, whatever. You say, what about this? I will immediately do what? I'll try to think of an example of that. It's just that simple. And we know from heaps and heaps and heaps of research that that mechanism is incredibly powerful. So if I try to think of an example of something and I go, I'm scratching my head, I'm coming up empty, that struggle will inform my intuition that this thing is incredibly rare. And if it's rare and it's a threat, then clearly the threat isn't all that serious, right? Don't worry about it. And that's where the origin, that's where your intuitive judgment comes from. Conversely, if you say, what about this? And I try to think of an example of this, and it leaps to mind instantaneously. And it's vivid, and it's horrible, and it makes me feel bad because this is an awful thing. Guess what? The very fact that it came to mind so easily tells me this thing is common. Run screaming to the hills. Very simple. Now, why is this such a basic mechanism that we use to make intuitive judgments? Well, think about the environment in which we evolved, right? To go back to a point from earlier, the environment in which we evolved was basically we spent almost all of human history as hunter-gatherers. Think about humans working as hunter-gatherers. If you can think of an example of a lion emerging from the long grass and dragging somebody to a screaming death, chances are it happened close to you because you don't have televised news. You only have the information of you and your fellow band members. So it happened close to you, and it happened recently because that's also a function of memory, right? Older memories fade. So if it happened recently and it happened near to you, yeah, you should be worried about a lion, right? So that mechanism really works in that environment. The problem is we don't live in that environment today. So you turn on the news and you see some horrible event happening. I gave an example in Risk of watching the news, and it was a story about, I think it was in Leipzig, Germany. It was CCTV footage of a predator approaching a child, and apparently he had snatched this child away and murdered the child. Horrible, vivid, the sort of thing that sticks in memory because that's how awful it is. I had young children at that time. They're older children now. And I would take them to the park. Well, what am I going to think about? Should I be worried about the stranger in the bushes? What am I going to do? I'm going to try and think of an example of the stranger in the bushes. Can I think of an example? Of course I can. I saw a vivid, full-color illustration of a predator snatching a child and taking that child away. Conclusion, be afraid of the stranger in the bushes. Now, you go and you do the analysis, the statistical analysis, as I did in Risk, and you discover that, in fact, no. No. Yes, these things do happen, but your child has a greater chance of being struck by lightning. So this is not actually something that you should be worried about, and yet people are worried about it, and people are adapting to that threat in maladaptive ways. They're doing things that actually are, in many cases, actually self-destructive. The most vivid example, I actually opened Risk with this, was the 9/11 terrorist attacks, right? If you're old enough, and unfortunately I certainly am, you remember watching live on television as that second plane slammed into the Twin Towers. And you remember how you felt and how awful that day and the week following was. But eventually life went on, and then you had to, go about your business. You had to travel. Okay, how are you going to travel? You going to get on a plane? Are planes safe? Can I think of an example of planes being hijacked and people dying as a result? You can't stop thinking of that example. And as a result, intuitively, you feel this overwhelming sense of this is a threat. Stay away from it. And that's, in fact, what happens. There multiple analyses have shown that there was a widespread, at least a 1 year long shift in the United States away from air travel towards, people still had to travel, towards car travel. Guess what? Car travel is actually less safe than air travel. And by some estimates, the number of people who died as a result of shifting from air travel to car travel was as much or greater than the number of people who died on 9/11 itself. This is a perfect example, a horrible example of how our intuitive, ancient, hardwired mechanisms for judging risk just are not adaptive to today. And we have to be aware of that in order to catch, again, to go back to my favorite phrase, catch and correct those mistakes.
It's interesting. It reminds me of an interactive, we host these interactive webinars for our community, and one of them was a discussion, it's a roundtable discussion and breakout groups around cybersecurity. And one of the takeaways from it was that those who had experienced a cyber attack prepared their organizations in a totally different way from those who hadn't experienced them.
Yep.
And if I sort of tie that together with some of the insights that you just shared there, and also from the book, that actually even just seeing this stuff, even if you haven't experienced it, so I think you were saying even just seeing stuff in a movie, your mind processes it and it feeds into that availability heuristic. So
yep.
Does that mean we should basically be showing boards horror movies of corporate disasters in order to better prepare them for their risk management?
Yeah, no, I mean, to an extent, I know you're being a little sardonic, but yeah, no, absolutely, that's right. As a general rule, human beings are really bad at responding to risks which they know exist, but they have not experienced. To take one of my favorite examples, solar storms. Our entire society is filled with electrical devices. Scientists tell us it is literally just a matter of time before we have a solar storm on the order of the Carrington event of the mid-19th century. What will happen when that happens? Oh, I don't even want to contemplate that. Are we going to prepare for that eventuality? We're not really, because it hasn't happened. So how then do you get people to grapple with very low probability events, which nonetheless are potentially catastrophic, and therefore they actually have to prepare for them? One of the ways that you can, in fact, do this is to work with human nature. And that includes exactly what you just described. Works of fiction, imagination, they matter. In one piece of research dating back from the 1970s, it was before the election of 1976, they asked people, to imagine that Gerald Ford won the election of 1976. And then they asked them to judge the probability of Gerald Ford winning. Or others were asked that about Jimmy Carter. And guess what happened? The very act of imagining the thing, seeing it, changed their estimate of the probabilities. So yes, we absolutely should be. If there is a problem where you know intellectually that you should be dealing with it, but you don't feel the threat because you've never experienced the threat. And you can't get people to rally around because they too have never experienced this thing. One way in order to do that is to communicate more vividly with vivid language, with images, and really engage people so that they can actually see and feel and touch and taste the threat.
I guess the flip side of that slightly terrified me reading your book was your point that you can't be inoculated. And so if, let's say, you're a board member and you've got a CEO who understands, say, anchoring, who before they bring up the compensation discussion starts dropping in billion-dollar numbers. and I guess as a board member, you can sort of go, okay, well, I can isolate myself, or I can flag this as that they're anchoring me. I'm going to start bringing up benchmarks to, but ultimately, I guess you're going to end up in a higher place than you might otherwise have done. Is that the case, or what would you say to a board member sort of starting to think as cynically as that?
Yeah, boy, if I ever caught somebody actually using anchoring in a fashion like that, boy, would my trust in that person plummet. Look, it's the same rule. It's A board member who recognizes that, in fact, my judgment about what is the appropriate number can be skewed by something as seemingly irrelevant as, a telephone number or some reference to some completely different number. That's an excellent board member, because that's a board member who's going to go, okay, here's the number I feel is correct, but half a tick, as we talked about earlier. I have time. I'm going to step back and I'm going to think about this more carefully. Is this supported by analysis? Right? I'm going to take that time to double check it, and therefore I'm more likely to catch and correct my mistakes. So yeah, kudos to any board member who's thinking in those terms.
We're gonna see CEOs around the world suddenly running quizzes on the population size of the 10 largest countries before the compensation review discussion. Dan, time has flown by, which means it is time for the lightning round, where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Sure, shoot.
So first up, best book every board member should read, and why?
Thinking Fast and Slow, obviously. Everyone's bought it. Some have read it. How many people have taken it on board? In my experience, not so many. Buy it, read it again, think hard about it.
Most valuable board ritual?
I don't know qualifies as a ritual. The pre-mortem, to me, if that qualifies as a ritual, I think it can become a learned behavior, right? Thinking, how can things go wrong? And then start from there. That's a terrific thing. And if you can make that habitual, that's terrific.
Favorite quote?
Favorite quote has got to be, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? By John Maynard Keynes. And the reason why it's my favorite quote is, number one, it's wonderful. It totally fits with how John Maynard Keynes thought and what made him brilliant. However, it's also not true. And what makes it wonderful for me is I once published that in a newspaper column, and I subsequently discovered that he never actually said those words. And so it is the one that has caused me to constantly ask myself, is this really correct? Just because it's repeated on the internet and just because I remember it this way doesn't mean so. I've got to go and check.
Your most significant professional insight?
That's got to be psychology itself. I discovered psychology circa 2006. We all have a mental model of how people think, perceive, and decide. Most of our mental models are not carefully examined. But when I studied psychology, it profoundly changed my mental model. And when you change your understanding of how people think, it changes everything.
Worst professional advice you've ever received? Be
more certain.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong, and what did you learn?
When did I would say, and this is like a really profound one for me, for most of my adult life, was one of those people who thought about inequality as being, I didn't care. Inequality was fine. If some person got very, very rich, much richer than I did, by legitimate means, by offering a good or service to the public, that's terrific. Good on them. Inequality didn't matter. But then I discovered the research on the social effects of inequality, and I realized actually there are implications to inequality that I had not considered, and I had to, against my own political inclinations, I had to change my opinion. And that hurt.
Are there any other things where you have changed your mind?
Oh boy, too long to list. I changed my mind from day to day. By the way, actually, this is a very useful technique. A lot of people are not familiar with, and I love this because it speaks to this, how variable our minds are, but we're not aware of it. If you make a judgment one day, write it down, slip it in your desk drawer, come back to it a week later, make it the same judgment without looking at the desk drawer, then take out what's in the desk drawer and compare your two judgments. Combine the two, you'll probably come up with a better judgment. In effect, what you're doing is you're drawing two different perspectives, because you 1 week from now is not the same as you today. There's a lot more variability in human judgment and individuals' judgment than people realize.
There's a wonderful Heraclitus quote dropped into our Ask the Community forum, which is, a man never steps into the same river twice. It's not the same man, it's not the same river, which I love.
Absolutely.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Oh, well, thank you for mentioning an ancient Greek. What a segue. Number 1, hubris. The ancient Greeks were right about it. It is the principal sin. It is the principal danger. It will destroy us all. Always be on guard for hubris. Number 2, intellectual or epistemic humility is the foundation of good judgment. It needs to be learned and cultivated. And 3, good judgment is a never-ending struggle.
Dan, we recently had Roger Martin, who's a fellow Canadian, on the podcast. I don't know what they're putting in the water over there, but it's obviously something very good. This has been such a treat. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience. I know our audience are going to love this.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the New Roll Board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing. Smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.newroll.com to find out more.